Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to India Game Changer. Today we are joined by Amit Gupta, founder of Ecosystem, and a spin-off of Ecosystem. I like this, already spinning things off, Camped. And I love the way Camped is spelled, by the way. Amit, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show. No, look, very good. And really excited about what 2023 holds for us.
So am I. I mean, God, 20 and 21, 22 is less miserable. 20 and 21 were just so unsure and so strange that 2023 feels like, I don't know, in a way, graduating from high school. Like, I'm out. I did it. I survived kind of thing. I don't know. I feel like I have a badge of honor that I never got COVID. I tried really hard. But anyway, 2023 should be super. Look, before we do this, and I love this, right? Because, look, one of the things the listeners don't know is what happens before we record. And I love the conversations we have. And I can tell you're going to be a great guest because I have to stop the conversation before we start recording and just say, let's just save that for the other stuff. So let's get to that first. Let's just get a little bit of your background for some context, and then let's jump in, yeah?
Yeah. So look, let me start with, my own background. Where you're from, that's a question I've always sort of asked myself because I've had so many different places that I've lived in.
Yeah, same here.
As I've grown up, UK, the Middle East, India, New Zealand, Singapore. I like to think of myself as a Kiwi Indian. So a Kiwi, very proud of that, very proud of my Indian heritage. And I grew up in the UK. So big part of my, education was in the UK and then followed by boarding school in India.
Interesting.
Which is great. I think
Which is weird because that's like reverse of what a lot of people in India do, right? They're like, okay, we're doing well. We're sending our kid to the UK for boarding school kind of thing, no?
Yeah. And look, I think it's quite interesting. And I actually owe a lot to my dad for where I am today.
Tell me.
Really, I think everyone does to their parents. And I do specifically to both my parents. I think academically, my parents make up for the lack of intellect that my brother, my only sibling, and I have. They're my mom's no more, but mom and dad have both been doctors and medical doctors and PhDs in their profession. So they kind of made up for any gaps that we might have.
Sure.
But my father was very particular. He felt that wherever we are, we should be global citizens. But at the same time, it was very important for us to sort of understand our roots. And he felt that, spending time in boarding school in India, would help with us both getting imbibed with the Indian culture and having the appreciation of our heritage, and at the same time also gear us up in case they plan to move back to India, so that we're better prepared for that.
So this is so interesting for me. I consider myself a third culture adult, right? So my daughter's mom is Japanese. So by definition, she's like a third culture kid. She grew up in Japan, but then partially in Thailand. But as an adult, I moved to Japan. So everything I know about growing up as an adult is Japanese. It's very strange. And I think for similar to you, I'm guessing, is I don't look like what I actually am, if that makes sense. Yep. Do you know what I mean? So when people see you, if I'm just on a train holding the thing and I see you across the way, I'm going to think, this guy is that thing, whatever it is, right? Whoever it is. And yet I think most of us aren't that thing anymore. Right. But I think it's really interesting because it was always important for me, for my daughter to understand the Japanese cultural side of her heritage. It was super important, right? Because Japan's a smaller country. India is different. But I can see your dad doing the same thing, like talking to your mom, talking to your brother, and talking to you and saying, look, we don't live in our home country, but we are Indian and it should be important to us at some level. But on the other hand, we need to look outside to the rest of the world as well and be a global citizen. I just think it's super cool and super insightful for your dad and very forward-looking, no?
Yeah, no, I do give him a lot of credit for a lot of things that I've accomplished in my life. And, if I really think about it, I always kind of felt your identity and where you're from are not necessarily always intertwined.
Yeah.
It's about how you bring it together.
Absolutely.
And how you blend the two together.
Yeah.
And like yourself, I would say most of my adult life is between New Zealand and Singapore.
Right.
And so for me, from a professional standpoint, as a grown-up, I identify myself as a Kiwi.
Yeah.
And interestingly, then when you look at me and you hear my name, it's not necessarily very, as straightforward to sort of correlate to.
Right. I mean, look, my name is Michael. I don't think you can get any more generic American for somebody, when I was born than Michael. My parents were just like, whatever. What's the name that a boy gets this year? That's his name. And in a way, Amit is a very common Indian name, right? So when people see it, they just think that thing. Same with me. So I get it completely.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, and Gupta is not less common
Right.
as a last name. So there's probably about 500 million Amit Guptas around. So
Probably. So how do we get to Ecosystem? So Camped is a spinoff, right? But I want to know how we get to Ecosystem first, then we can understand why Camped is Camped.
So I guess maybe I'll sort of take you through a bit of a backstory.
Go for it.
And it does sort of link back to what we were discussing earlier. You know, one of the things that I got from my dad was, and both my brother and I, and we owe this to him. I think we've sort of benefited from the gene pool that we've had, honestly. Sure. And the biggest thing I got from my dad was he said, "Hey, look, do whatever you want in life. I'll back you. I'm always there for you.
Yeah.
Just whatever you do, make sure you do what you think is right.
Yeah.
But do what you want to do."
Right.
And that freed up our thought process. So we were never really shackled by sort of the traditional career pathways that young folk look at.
Right.
So, I became an entrepreneur at a very young age. My brother became an entrepreneur at a very young age. I had an exceptional experience as an early entrepreneur. And after I exited my first venture, I would have been in my late 20s. And that was after having spent 6 years as an entrepreneur. And my first real proper corporate job was working with one of the biggest technology analyst firms. And I always looked at that as actually there's a backstory there. I wanted to work for that company, and I reached out to the country MD at that point at IDC, and he never responded. But serendipity, about a year later, I had a headhunter who reached out and offered me an opportunity with IDC, and I decided to pursue it. I thought that was quite exciting. That it seemed like my prayers were being answered. I looked at IDC as an opportunity for me to fast track myself into the corporate world, get a better handle on the New Zealand technology ecosystem, because as an analyst firm, it was the best way I could get a bird's eye view of what the market was, what the ecosystem looked like, and also build a very strong network. And I thought that was just the right thing for me to do. And as I gear up for my corporate career, and once I got into it.
Can I ask you this though? What was it like going from having your own company? Because it looks like maybe you just graduated from university and went right into entrepreneurship, right? Your dad said, do whatever you want, just do the right thing, right? So you went out, you did the right thing, you did it, you said you had this exceptional experience. It's rare, I think, then for somebody, even at, what did you say, 20-something years old, to then say, I want to go into the corporate career. But it seems like you had a plan.
Well, you always have to have a plan, right? I mean, that's the thing about being an entrepreneur as well. You always have to have a plan. There's always many, many plans that you fall back on. Yeah. But, I started my entrepreneur journey when I was 23. I raised capital, went through lots of learnings. We scaled up the company, but then there were also a lot of things that were very challenging and things that I learned that I shouldn't have been doing. And the biggest part of my learning was that I needed better experience in sort of managing P&Ls, managing operational efficiencies. Yeah. I understood the big picture, get the business, get the capital, scale up. But how do you then build the rigor into the business? But fortunately, I had an opportunity when I was, again, would have been 28 or 29, when I got offered money for my equity in the business. And I decided it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, it was enough for me to take some time out and take a long holiday and contemplate what I wanted to do next. And I decided to take the money. I stepped out. I considered what sort of opportunities I'd want to do. I definitely wasn't prepared to be an entrepreneur at that point.
Right.
It's, you take some pretty hard knocks in that journey, and while you enjoy it, it is one of those things where you need to recoup, recharge.
For sure.
And my view was that I needed a job that I would enjoy, and not just for the money. And the money was important, but not as important, because I still had some left over. So IDC to me was the place where I felt I could really grasp that understanding of the technology landscape, where the markets were going,
Yep.
what my next move could be, and getting to meet all the leaders in the tech ecosystem, because that's what analysts do.
Right.
And I decided to pursue that, and there was no looking back from that. And interestingly, I came into the business as sales and consulting head in New Zealand, and I realized very early on that it had so much potential. It was so under-monetized for a business that had been around for 20 years in New Zealand.
Wow.
As a global company,
Yeah.
it had been growing, the usual sort of 8-10% year on year, and I just felt like, wow, I mean, you got access to this entire market. We should just we should take it to a different level.
Yeah, we should be
And
killing this thing, right?
yeah, and I decided to kind of be the entrepreneur within IDC, and scaled up that business about 5x in 5 years. And
Wow.
yeah, and it was a great part of the journey. It was probably one of the most exciting times of my life, not just my professional life, my life overall, because there was just so much personal growth for me
Yeah.
in that whole process in
Yeah.
every way.
How do you take what you learn at IDC though and then build it out into the companies that you already have? I mean, look, you and I kind of did everything a little bit in reverse, right? I did a corporate life from the moment I graduated from college. I worked at Morgan Stanley, I worked at Citigroup, I worked at Goldman Sachs. It was all corporate. And it's weird, right? Because I don't talk about this a lot, but when you do that for 20 years at companies of that caliber, you kind of feel like getting little things done is easy, right? Because you're like, we need two more of those, and then they just show up, and you're like, we need to have an infrastructure that does this, and the IT team just builds it. Do you know what I mean? You're not really doing the same level of resource management. Planning's important, but it's not like it is when you start off with just like you and your buddy, and you're like, okay, who's going to do that thing? You're like, I don't know. I thought you were going to do it, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So what do you take out of IDC into, again, restarting your own stuff and then building it up into something big?
It's quite interesting. I would look at it kind of in the reverse.
Good. Tell me.
So, and I'll just sort of, just for context, I'll sort of end the journey with IDC as well. So,
Go ahead.
from New Zealand. So, long story short, 2008, the financial crisis hit.
Mm.
I'd been the MD in New Zealand, one of the smallest markets probably for IDC, but because we had been growing at that pace,
Right.
we were extremely profitable. For 2 years, we were the most profitable business unit per headcount. The growth had been absolutely exceptional. And at that point, I got nudged to come in and take responsibility for the entire target for all of Asia Pacific, and that's how I moved to Singapore.
Got it.
So
I love it. I
to
love
to
it.
scale up the business here, and it was quite ironic because we had just hit the global financial crisis when the role was offered to me,
Right.
and I just my wife and I had just had twin boys, and we were told that you could get a full-time nanny in Singapore, which is quite easy.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I'm not going to complain about that. My wife was quite happy with that decision. We thought we'd be closer to India. We'd be in the middle of Asia. It'll be interesting, good time to experiment with that. And the only thing was people questioned whether it was the right move to take that role at the start of the financial crisis. And I said, well, this could go both ways.
Yeah.
You could potentially mount to nothing. And then I could say, well, was the financial crisis and I could come back to doing something else,
Exactly.
or could really make a killing and you could actually make a difference to the business. And I chose the latter option. I came up here, we implemented lots of changes over time, not immediately. I wanted to get my feet under the desk, understand the business. I traveled around all the 14 countries that I oversaw, understood the issues, spoke to our customers, understood how they were tackling the crisis. And then really we spent time on re-gearing our entire product strategy, our people strategy. We changed the way we were measuring people. We did make some changes in the teams, but effectively ended up streamlining the business to a point where we ended up having the following year the best year ever. And I then went on for another 4 years in that role and really enjoyed it. And then I realized that I was getting limited by all the resource and capability that you were referring to earlier that you get in corporate life.
Interesting.
And I felt like it was quite interesting. The CFO of the business, who was a very dear friend as well over the years, every year we'd have this song and dance where I always put rigor, because if you remember, I mentioned one of the gaps that I had in my startup journey was operational efficiency.
Yep.
And a view on how to manage the P&L.
Yep.
So one of the things that I did with the vengeance in IDC was to really focus on learning those aspect. So I actually understood the P&L very well.
Good for you.
And I would then do a song and dance with the CFO around the targets. And, I'd do a bottom up roll up with all the country heads. We'd work through the targets and see how it all rolled up into Asia Pacific. And then I'd go to the CFO with pitch, and then he would give me a number. I'd be like, Mark, you could just give me the number and save me 3 months of angst for me and my team putting effort into that process.
If you're just going to say yes.
Yeah, because I said to him, that I'm not going to pull the number out of thin air. So we've actually gone through a process. So, but all in good spirit. It would always be a very productive discussion with him. But then I also realized that the market was changing, the world was changing, digital was changing, right? And
how did it manifest itself? Like, how did you see that? I get it. I saw it too, but I can tell you how I saw it. But I'm curious how you saw this manifest itself in the domain in which you were working.
Well, to me, it was, the first signs of it were that our biggest customers were starting to really struggle because of their size and scale. They weren't able to navigate. So those were telltale signs that something was changing in the market that these legacy players were not able to deal with.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is, to me, the biggest shift came about in the early 2010s. And I think people don't give enough credit to this company, but I would say, AWS, Amazon Web Services, which came out of Amazon, has a lot to do with how the market changed.
It's really interesting, right?
They introduced the whole concept of public cloud,
hosting,
hyperscale, enabling very new breed of these emerging tech players that were coming in, and they were coming in fast. They were growing fast. And guess what? The likes of IDC and its competitors, Gartner, Forrester, the traditional technology analyst firms, were not geared up to deal with them. And neither did these companies have any legacy relationships with these firms.
Right.
And that's where I saw the biggest shift in the market. It went from, the market literally being owned by the top 10 technology companies in the world to now a very fragmented tech landscape. And I felt like there was a new breed of customers that were emerging, and the traditional firms weren't going to be able to deal with that. And that's when I felt the need that there was an opportunity for us to look at getting into something that was itself a technology-based business that would solve the needs of this new emerging breed of companies, and yet also give more efficient offerings at a better price to the big traditional players.
Right. Yeah, and to be fair, AWS allowed a lot of companies to do that. I don't think we would actually be... I think we'd probably still have 5 venture capitalists in the United States the same way we did back in like 2005. I'm exaggerating a little bit to make the point, but I think we'd be in the same situation if we didn't have a company like AWS that said, starting your company now costs you $5,000 and not $500,000. Again, I'm making up the numbers, right, just to make the point. But the idea that, look, I worked in the machine room at Morgan Stanley, okay? So part of my job there was setting up with a team of people a floor of 120 Sun Spark stations, running a machine room that did all the backups. So I took tapes out of machines on the weekends and stuff, like did all this stuff. And it was very expensive. And that was one of the barriers to entry of becoming Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, right? Was you had to be able to run these massive data centers. And now it's, in a way, it's not even necessary. I can start up my company. You can start up your company. Camped can run in the cloud. Whereas before you would have had to like buy servers. And every time you got like 5 more customers, you'd have to be like, hey, we need another server and 10 more of this and that. And now you're just like, you just have another machine at Amazon in the background, or anybody really running this stuff. And it's just a completely massive paradigm change in the way companies get built and run.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think, from then on, of course, we've seen that get even more sort of democratized with players like Microsoft and Google, and now Oracle coming into that space. So
super interesting.
I could go on and on about this, Michael. I'm a technology analyst, but no, I'm sure there's other stuff you want to talk about.
But again, see, in the same way, right? And one of the reasons why I like doing it in this format is there are things about me that you don't know either, right? So this idea, like, I love having these conversations about the technology and the impact that it has on business, because that's the way I've always looked at this. In the same way, when I was at Morgan Stanley, I was the guy at the firm who was like, we've been using Lotus 1-2-3 forever, but now that Windows is out, we're using this like DOS-based spreadsheet program when Microsoft makes Excel. And you can laugh about this, and I don't mean you, but I mean one can laugh about this part of the conversation, but Like when Excel came out, I had already been using it at home and I brought it into work. And back then you could convince, it was easier to convince the IT departments you could put new software in there. So we started using it in Japan. I started writing some of the scripts in Visual Basic as opposed to using the writer. I can't even remember what it's called anymore in 123. And it was just a massive change in the efficiency. Just to give you an example, why I care about this. When I first started reporting P&Ls to the options desk, again, too much information, they used to get their P&L reports T+1 and then after the market closed. I would give it to them at 7 o'clock in the morning on T+1. So it was almost like 12 hours faster. And when they saw that, they were like, okay, this is some kind of voodoo magic that's happening in the back office now. Maybe you want to work in the front office. And that changed my career. But again, it's that insight, that seeing that digital change that changed my entire life. And I think the same type of thing happened to you in your domain. And that's why I asked why. And that's why also when you explain it, it's so fascinating to me because I wasn't there for that, but I saw something similar in my domain as well. Super interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I just listening to, what sort of prompted that for you. It's really about, it does really come down to just that one thing you can spot and the opportunities that you spot, right?
Yeah.
And your ability to connect the dots. It's so important. And I think any journey can be successful if you're able to pick those opportunities and connect the dots.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a skill you never lose. And to be fair, I like how you said you have to thank your parents for the genetics, but because you have good genetics, you don't ever let that skill die. And the more you work, the longer you work, the more experience you have, the easier it actually becomes to connect the dots because you can get the same feeling that you had back then when you saw AWS much earlier now because you know what that feeling is. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And also about understanding what your gaps are. If you remember, I mentioned my gaps around developing stronger understandings of P&Ls. And as I said, I took that on with a vengeance. And literally, one of the skills that I developed over time was I can actually see spreadsheets in my head.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can.
So if there's a number that's given to me, or if there's a number that I've seen, or if one of our country leaders shared their number or their forecast, I would never forget that because that's in a spreadsheet in my head. So it was that ability to be able to visually see spreadsheets that I think really helped me keep the dots connected.
Do you do this as well? Let's say somebody tells you a number in a spreadsheet. Let's just say it's, I don't know, CAGR, whatever it is, right? You're like, okay, but if that's that number, then there's got to be the other number that leads into that has to be X. And if that's true, then your month on month has to be this. And if that's true, you need to do this in the warehouse. It's something you can do, I think, now that maybe you couldn't do 15 years ago. You know what I mean? Or 20 years ago, whatever it is. Yeah.
Probably, but not as good as you, Michael, because you've obviously, you've been a Morgan Stanley investment banker.
Stop it. Stop it. That wasn't the point. That wasn't the, I'm not nearly as smart as you are. Not a chance. Neither one of my parents have a PhD for sure.
Oh, look, it's, as they say, it generally skips a generation anyway. I did have something to share. So when I got my master's degree, and actually, I'm quite proud of it. Not that I was aiming for it, but I came up top of class in Auckland University of Auckland. And when I shared that with my dad, and he kind of joked with me, and he said, great. I'm really happy to see you finally decided to get an education, after a master's degree. And interestingly, I actually got a letter from the dean inviting me to join the PhD program.
Right.
I actually then sent that letter to my dad, saying, "Hey, I could do it, but I've decided not to pursue this, but just letting him know that I could be a PhD as well."
It's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we could spend hours talking about the impact that our parents have on and our extended families have on the lives that we end up leading.
Absolutely.
It sounds like your extended family is pretty fascinating and pretty wonderful as well, which is it's a great start, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love them. So
fair enough.
Not embarrassed to say that on radio.
No. Loving your family is definitely not something anybody should be embarrassed about. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Let's spend a little time talking about Ecosystem, and then let's talk about how it led to the spinoff of Camped.
Sure.
Go for it. what is Ecosystem and what does it do? And then what was it building that actually said, wait a second, this other thing also should get spun out? Because that's interesting too, yeah?
Yeah. So as I mentioned to you, part of the learning for me was that the markets were changing,
Yeah.
and we felt that there was a better way that research could be delivered.
Yep.
And actually, it was interesting. The more I thought about it, and also you have to bear in mind, Michael, that I always looked at the world as an entrepreneur, and it for me to actually exit a company like IDC also required some sort of a
courage. It's like an insane amount of courage. It just does. You don't need to say it, but I'll say it.
yeah,
And I'll
just
tell
an
you why.
awakening.
Yeah,
Just an
but
awakening.
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why I think. And again, I'm interrupting because I'm excited. But here's the thing: nobody succeeds alone, but also nobody exists alone. Do you know what I mean? Like when my brother graduated from medical school, I don't know who was happier, him or my dad.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
in the same way that when the dean came to you and said, we want to invite you into the PhD program, which is a huge accomplishment, I'm sure internally you were like, yeah. But now you can share the pride with the family and make them think like, yeah, I know you joke about me sometimes, but actually I'm doing good kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Go ahead.
absolutely. And for me, there were a few factors. So one was the awakening that um, how much ever I valued the company,
Yeah.
it wasn't my company.
Right.
Because remember, I came in as an entrepreneur. So for me, I always treated my work like it was my work. And to me, it took a little bit of time to detach myself emotionally from that process. So that was step number one. Step number two was I did feel that there was a better way to do it. And that's how we started Ecosystem.
Yeah.
It was a process to go through to actually get to start that journey. But I felt that it was a little bit ironic that when I looked at the company that I worked for and its core global competitors, the fact that this is the industry that actually help companies, enterprises evolve their business model using technology.
Yeah.
I always found it very ironic that their business model was so archaic itself, right? So, how does the traditional analyst business work? So,
Right.
they run surveys. How are surveys run? Through phone-based call centers, right? Or online surveys. And then someone has to collate that data into spreadsheets or SPSS or whatever.
Right.
It's a lot of human intervention. And then the subscription research is delivered through PDF documents. And now, is that not completely counterintuitive to what we're telling the market
Right
on
to
how they
do.
should be aligning their business? Yeah. And I just felt that with the tools available, with the technology available, that process could be a lot more streamlined and made more efficient, where you can actually service a new segment of the market. But to the existing customer base, you can actually start to service them in a way that's much more efficient,
Yeah.
both from a cost and time perspective. And that was the genesis of Ecosystem. So we put the data at its core. So we built a technology-led platform that allowed enterprises to consume research. And as part of that whole process, they have to input their data to get the benchmarks. And it allows us to keep building the anonymous research around different segments of the market. And so that was really the data journey at its core. And then we built the efficiencies around that. Once we got that piece sorted, once that got automated, what it did for us is it not only reduced the friction, the need for human intervention reduced, which meant that the cost came down, potential errors came down, and most importantly, it made the data available on a real-time basis. So our customers could get market sensing on a real-time basis, as opposed to, if you remember, Michael, you were talking about how you were sending the update T+1.
Yep.
And if you think about how the current process had been working in that research industry, you're collating all that data, it's being cleaned up, someone has to then manipulate that, put it into buckets, and all of that takes time, which meant that all the data that customers were getting was from 3 or 4 months ago,
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed to real
Yep.
time.
Yeah.
So we solved that problem. So that gave us a great entry point. And our business model, in terms of the way we deliver the services, is very different, and that enabled us to actually, I'd like to think, become the first company in the last 20 or 30 years that actually truly took on some of the big global competitors in the technology analyst industry and service some of the biggest customers.
Yeah, so this is the key question though, right? In other words, you could easily, not easily, but you could go back to your old customers and say, look, we've cracked this nut and we've figured out a way to make our side of the business more technologically advanced in the same way that we've been telling you to. And what that's done to us is it made us way more efficient. That's great. So now you can go back to the same clients and just say, we can do this for you better, faster, cheaper. But what it also did, I think, and again, tell me where I'm wrong here, is that it expanded the number of clients that you could deal with because your whole process was now automated and in real time. So not only could they see the impact of it immediately, but you could service a company with, I'm guessing, right, with 5 or 10 people in it, the same way you could deal with a company with 500,000 people in it, because everything that they were doing was tech-based. Is that right?
Yeah, that was, I couldn't have said it better. That was absolutely
Okay, I'm
that was
going home.
absolutely the objective, and that's why the whole concept of democratization. And I've had
Yeah,
some friends say to me, "Hey, democratize is not necessarily a very positive word." I said, "For me, it is. All
why?
I'm talking about is a level playing field for
Yeah,
everyone. It should be no different dealing with that 5-man outfit
right.
versus dealing with the 300,000 employee technology giant. So they should all be able to get the same experience, the same level of service. Of course, the way they would pay for it would be different just based on the scale of the
Sure.
service they need, but it doesn't put anyone at a disadvantage. And it's quite interesting. One of our biggest customers, and I'd like to think of them as one of the 3 biggest technology companies in the world.
Yeah.
The head of market intelligence, global market intelligence. Actually, the place might not be appropriate. We both came out of the washroom and we were walking back to the meeting room together.
Yep.
And he said, hey, Amit, I just wanted to say something to you. Um, we're truly inspired by what folks like you and your companies do.
Right.
He said, it just shows us that there's always a better way of doing things that makes the service delivery process so much more nimble and agile. And I thought that was a great sort of validation. And this was, bear in mind, this was in the first year of our journey.
Right.
So that meant a lot to me at that
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
because we were still in the process of getting our product up, getting some early beta customers, and I think it did help us that our customers who were technology companies themselves or enterprises adopting technology looked at us and went, they actually get technology because they know how to use it efficiently for themselves.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing worse than having somebody talk to you about, and I'm putting it in quotes, right? Digital transformation, and you go into their office and it looks like a Japanese company out of the 1970s, right? Like they have a steel desk and, the printers are not connected and all this other stuff. You're like, you're telling me what to do? That doesn't feel right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think all of these big companies, right? You mentioned IDC, Gartner, and all this stuff. They were started, who knows when, like in the 50s or 60s, right? I mean, I think IDC was
Yes.
probably called IDC, probably naming themselves after IBM. It must have been a thing to call yourself like International Something Company, right?
Yeah.
So,
Probably.
yeah, so I get that. But you went right to ecosystem. So it wasn't international this or that. Gartner obviously named after a person, but you didn't name it like, Gupta Corporation either. What was the idea around, because every company's name actually matters, at least it does at the beginning. You're like, what are we going to do? What do we want to let people know about us? And, so one of my companies called Undercover Media. And the reason why we called it Undercover is because we think every company should be their own media company, but we don't think we should be the people that are known. We think the company should be known. So we want to do it kind of undercover, right? And we thought about this a lot. So it's the same thing. What's the idea around ecosystem? It seems like a dumb question. Like that's BS thing just to take time, but I'm really curious about the thought process around why that mattered so much.
There's a practical response to that, and I'll give you that version, and then I'll give you the actual emotional, philosophical reason for the name as well. Yeah, because I do believe, and I always say this to a number of other entrepreneurs I speak to, and Michael, you know that I'm very involved in TIE, which
Yep.
is the world's largest entrepreneur organization. It's
Yep.
a not-for-profit, and it's really that ecosystem that brings that ability to give the support structure to other founders and entrepreneurs.
Right.
And it's a community of entrepreneurs and investors. And I've benefited from that. I've been very deeply involved in that. In fact, I'm the current president for the Singapore chapter, and I'm also on the global board of trustees of TIE. And one of the things that I always say is entrepreneurship, people talk about passion.
Yeah.
Entrepreneurship comes from passion, yes. But what drives passion? What drives passion is emotion. And as an entrepreneur, that's why, for me, that story around the name, there's the practical reason and the philosophical, emotional reason.
Tell me.
So the practical reason is the business model is based on being able to service the needs of our customers by bringing the entire technology ecosystem together, which is the technology providers, the technology consumers, the enterprises, and the analysts.
Yeah.
And to us, it was very, very simple. If we did a true ecosystem play, one would feed off the other,
Yeah.
and would make the whole process more efficient and be able to service the entire ecosystem and give something back to them. And to me, that's what represented who we were. And
Right.
it was about bringing the ecosystem together. On a philosophical note, where it's a little bit different, I was in Kuala Lumpur on work, and
Okay.
I'd taken my wife and my twin boys along, and I had to straddle the weekend. And we were staying at the West End in Kuala Lumpur, and I thought, Saturday morning, thought I'd go and spend some time in the lounge. When you got twin boys, young twin boys, you do need some time out as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so while my wife and I were having, enjoying our coffee, and I just felt like there were so many people that had impacted my life. I wanted to personally have the opportunity at some stage to thank them whenever I spoke to them, or proactively find that opportunity. And I started
Right.
to write down some of these names. And I then realized that that list was so long, I needed to then ask the um, the staff there for an A3 size of sheet of paper.
Right. I need bigger paper.
And I started to write down the names there. And then I realized that, Bob knew Graham, Graham knows Steve, Steve knows X, and they also, and it was all crisscrossing the names. You remember that game we used to play when we were kids, we'd do it in school, like match the words.
Yep.
And that's how I started matching people, and that became sort of my network. And then I wrote in the middle of that sheet, Amit's ecosystem.
Yeah.
And when I decided to set up the company, I decided to call it Ecosystem. And actually, one of the people on that list, Steve Scott, who's a very dear friend from New Zealand, Steve was like, "Yeah, it's a really cool name, but I'd suggest you drop the E. Sounds a little bit more cooler." So, and that's how we came up with the ecosystem without the E.
So
So I owe
I
that
mean,
to
because that was the
Steve.
follow-on, has to be, right? It's like, is this just an internet, domain name server problem where like somebody had already owned it and you were like, screw them, I'm just going to drop the E? Or no, it wasn't actually. Somebody just said it looks cooler without it. I like it.
Yeah, and it did not help with the internet domain, because someone is scoring on that ecosystem without the E. We've
Unbelievable.
been trying to get hold of it for some time. If you're listening in, please help us, give us that. But which is why our URL is ecosystem360.com, because
Yeah.
we give a 360 view of the ecosystem. But that also comes to bite us, because it irks me when people refer to us as Ecosystem 360 rather than Ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no, we're not Ecosystem 360. We have changed that now, because, as you know, there are multiple options now with
Yeah.
internet naming, URL naming, because we now have ecosystem.io.
Good.
So, which helps.
Good. I'll use that one from now on. I see you've also done the same thing with camped. There's no E, there's no C either as well. So I think you just went a little bit nutty, I think, with the naming of this. What is camped?
We have fun with that sort of stuff. I always like to say, whatever you do, you gotta have fun doing
Yeah,
it, and you gotta have small wins along the way.
exactly.
So yeah, so Camp was interesting. Camp started life originally at Ecosystem 2.0, as we were looking at our next growth journey at Ecosystem.
Right.
We realized that there were areas where we were able to solve the needs of our customers, but there were also areas that we had started to realize were emerging as very evident that we couldn't solve it. And
Yeah,
I'll give you some background context on that.
please.
If you look at technology analyst business, like the competitors that I named and like ourselves at Ecosystem, it's not just research that you offer for consumption in terms of planning and strategy. So obviously
Okay.
we give research services which are either in subscription format or specific projects where companies have specific needs, either as a technology provider to get into new markets, or they want to launch products, they want to understand the adoption by behavior and that sort of stuff for competitive landscape, or you're an enterprise and you want to understand and build your technology roadmap. That's your traditional view of what research is. But if you go beyond that, there's a bucket there that the market doesn't realize, but actually contributes to a big part of the revenue base of research firms, and whether it's an IDC, Gartner, Forrester, or ourselves at Ecosystem. And that is really supporting technology providers with their go-to-market and through thought leadership content, through market engagement. And if you think about it, when was the last time you saw an enterprise software company advertise? You would never really see them advertise. Very rare, right? And most of their marketing spend from an advertising perspective, if I can call it that, really goes into content-led thought leadership. And that's where they would work with analyst brands and influential analysts to have them write or talk about a particular industry pain point, a solution that aligns well with their messaging. Right. And that's what they use to build their brand and reach and influence their customer segment or their target customer segment. So that's a big part of our business as well. And as we were doing more and more of that, what started to bother me was, while we had solved the problem around making the whole research and data piece a lot more efficient, more robust, and solving that pain point for the market, I started to think about, how do you solve this? Because companies spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on content-led marketing. Where does all that content go? I mean, they run a campaign, they'll put it up on social media, they'll send it through an email blast using a CRM tool. What do they actually get from that? Apart from actually, maybe if you're using a tool like HubSpot or Salesforce, you'll get to see how many people opened it and viewed it. But do you even know what they did with it? Did they like it? Did it resonate? No. So I just felt that there was a better way that we could create some efficiency around all of this marketing waste. And the more I thought about it, I felt, could there not be a platform where you can bring communities together, where people can engage with like-minded people, and then brands can benefit by then targeting their messaging to those communities in a way that's not advertising, but they're adding value to that community by actually sharing really good quality content to drive engagement. And so one thing led to another. We realized then that as we started to work through shaping the business plan, shaping the product roadmap, we realized that the journey that this business would traverse would be very different from Ecosystem. And I wanted to make sure that, first of all, I didn't want to impact our firstborn just because of our ambition. So I wanted to make sure that we de-risked Ecosystem. We had worked really hard to turn it into a profitable, high-growth business very quickly in its journey, and I didn't want to impact that piece. And I also felt that the business that we were trying to build, the new evolution of it, had a different journey it had to traverse, both in terms of the business roadmap, the investment roadmap. So we decided to spin it off as a separate company. And that's how CAMPT was born. And CAMPT is short for Knowledge Amplified. And we wanted to, and as we went through that whole thought process, my own thought process changed, my own purpose changed. We switched it from, yes, we eventually want to solve the problems of these customers that we are serving at Ecosystem, but the purpose became a lot bigger than that. And I started to realize that there are so many in the knowledge economy. Everything is moving so fast. The pace of change is so rapid that people are really struggling to keep up. I mean, even as an analyst, I struggle to keep up. I mean, there's Web3, metaverse, ESG, sustainability in tech, climate tech, all of these pieces all of these terms that are being thrown at people, and professionals are really struggling to figure out, how does that sort of fit in with their world and what they're doing. And the best way, I felt, for people to continue their growth journey and learn is to engage with like-minded people. And then I started to think about, where are like-minded people engaging? At the moment, it's really on messaging apps. And messaging apps are, again, very fleeting moment. There's no real thread of conversations, because, Michael, you could actually share your perspectives on, say, the metaverse on a WhatsApp group, and then 2 messages or 2 responses later, I could be saying, "Hey, happy birthday, Bob." And that whole conversation is derailed. And
you can't search it. There's no way to itemize it. There's no way to get the data from it. You can't meta tag it. Like, there's nothing you can do. It's really frustrating, actually, because it's there.
Absolutely. You described it. You described the pain points, and the conversations are not centered on point because they keep moving.
Yeah.
And I felt that if there was a better way to bring in that ability for communities, for like-minded people to engage in communities, but you still need something to anchor that engagement, and
Right.
that's where content comes in.
Yeah.
So that was the genesis of Camp, and we felt if we could solve this problem for professionals by virtue of bringing in communities that are anchored by exceptional content, and then you start to then bring in the whole leverage around the creator economy. You then start to bring in all of these thought leaders and experts who are able to come and shape the thought process and then eventually be able to monetize.
Right.
So that was really it. Those were the 3 C's for us: communities, content, and creators.
I love it. And what's the status of Camp right now? Like, how long ago did you spin that out, and how big is that? How fast is that? Like, what's going on there? Obviously, you can see why it's interesting to me because, I mean, you heard me say it earlier. I think everybody should be their own media company, and that aligns almost completely with what you're saying, right? This idea of you should be able to tell your own story. And I always go back to the same experience I had when I was 19 or 20 years old. My girlfriend's dad said to me, you can either live life or let life live you. And in the
Yeah.
same way, I feel about storytelling. You can either tell the story or let somebody tell the story for you. And the idea is you know the story better than everybody else. And barring you, lying and just like devolving into propaganda, it's better for you to tell that story than for waiting to somebody else to tell that story for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And to tell the story, you've got to make sure that there is a way to keep continuity of those stories
Yeah, exactly.
because it can't be one off.
No way.
And it was interesting. I had someone on my team mention that we're the world's first professional community platform. And I said, great. So that's the statement that you're going to put out on LinkedIn to say we're the world's first professional community platform. I said, isn't that ironic putting it on the world's first largest community platform, which is
Right.
LinkedIn, right?
Exactly.
But that is one professional community. We are all one professional community of 900 million people,
Right. So that's the
right?
thing, though. And this gets back to one of my other theories, and this is another one of the reasons why I want to talk to you. Let's just go through this really quickly, right? When I was a kid and when you were a kid, and definitely when my parents were kids, there was a small shopping street in their town, and it had a butcher on it, it had a baker on it, it had a guy that made suits. Next to them was the leather goods guy, and
Yep.
he made shoes and belts and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you had these gigantic department stores come in and just go, yeah, we're just going to disambiguate that. We're going to consolidate all that stuff, and they can get everything in the same place. And at the beginning, it was a revelation because you could just go to one place and you could pay for it all at once. It was just simpler, right? In a way, it was almost like an offline Amazon. But then,
Yep.
just like Amazon, to be fair, discovery became impossible and service was upside down because nobody could know all the products. So what happened was you had this reverse process of fragmentation take place where people went back out and said, I'm just going to take my shoe store out of the department store and put it back on Madison Avenue. And I've always thought that as LinkedIn, just as an example, and Facebook is the same thing, grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, the discovery just becomes impossible and the experience is terrible. So what happens is people split off and you get these smaller communities where it's really impactful and really important. So if I want to talk to you about media and about business and about technology, I know exactly where to go. I don't have to sift through 1,000 different things to get there. And if that's what Camped is, at least at some level, you're saying, yeah, I get the professional connection, super necessary. I get the fact that we want to share things with each other. I get the fact that we want to have the same conversations. But what I don't want to do it is under a circus tent. I want to do it in a conference room. And that's what this seems like to me. It's a conference room at some level with really great content inside it as well. Am I close?
Yeah, very, very close. And if I put it in my word, I would say it is place to discover professional communities, creators, and content.
Yeah, that's where you
And
get paid the
then
big bucks because you're better at that than I am. Go ahead.
and then once you've discovered those communities, then you can engage with like-minded people within those communities.
Fair enough.
So it's just a different way. It's about removing that friction of discovery.
Yeah.
So the starting point on Camp is it enables you to discover those communities, discover those creators that you want to follow and engage. And then once you're in those communities, then the conversations are a lot more relevant. And then
Yeah.
idea is a community has to be a place where everyone has a voice.
Right.
So it is in a place where you're able to share your perspectives and thoughts within that community that you're interested in, or that you're part of. And it's also Camp is also a place where you can actually share content from, and your perspectives on that content from anywhere.
Is there like a plugin or something or an API that somebody can connect to? Here's the thing, right? So I have this podcast about India. I have the podcast about tech. I have a podcast about insurance. I'd love to be more interactive with the people that listen to it. Again, just so you know, the Asia Tech podcast has listeners in 170 countries. So a lot of people are paying attention, but they don't know who the other person is. So how do you take the platform, get the content on it, and then allow people to go, hey, I listened to that too, and this is what I thought. That's what you thought? Well, we're building that. How can we work together? Because that's the real power, no? I'm simplifying, but you understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And look, let me ask you this. Your cumulative audience, Michael, across all your podcasts, what would that look like? Are we talking about millions of viewers? Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands. Yeah. I don't know if you get into the millions of viewers, but hundreds of thousands for sure.
Yeah. And that's a very, very large number for any kind of a media subscription base.
And they're intentional, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now imagine if there was a place where all of them can share their perspectives on what they're learning of your podcast, sharing their point of views, and they all bring their point of view to life. And you're able to see how people are using what they're learning from your podcast and what are they actually taking away from it. Now, you could actually build your own community on Camped. You can actually natively put up the content on Camped in any format, whether it's video, whether it's audio, whether it's textual, or you could leave it wherever it is at the moment, and you could just share the link and give you a quick snippet of what that content is and still be able to lead traffic back to where you want to keep it.
Right.
But at the same time, in your community, everyone, and by virtue of being in the community on Camped, your content becomes discoverable on Camped, which will bring in more people to come and join your community, and your own community within your camp. And that's very original. We call a community a camp on Camped. So on your Michael White's camp, you could actually have people sharing their perspectives. I could share my thoughts on your podcast that I'm viewing,
right,
and that would then drive more traffic and my audience base to that.
Yeah, so we're going to have to test that. Knowledge amplified. I liked it. And I also like this idea of this disambiguation, right? The fragmentation of something that was consolidated. It's something that I think about a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about platforms versus products, right? This is obviously a platform, not a product. It has its own products and stuff like that, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this too. So this is why this is really interesting.
Beyond, what I do professionally at Ecosystem and now at Camped, I think there's a few things I want to just share as an entrepreneur, because I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship, because my firm belief is that entrepreneurship solves some of the biggest challenges in the world.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all.
And that includes everything from some of the biggest issues that we're grappling with, like climate change, wealth inequity. I mean, we live in Asia. We know what that's like. Yeah. Digital is the equalizer. And I think entrepreneurship is on fast track in most parts of Asia. And I think a lot of the change that we're seeing is a result of entrepreneurship. And
this goes back to AWS. You couldn't be an entrepreneur at scale when I was a kid because it was just prohibitively expensive. Now it's not. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but it also goes back to the point you made when we were talking about AWS. The comparative example you shared, Michael, was, and I know it was more to exemplify, but there were 5 VCs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But look at the VC ecosystem today. I mean, let's put aside all the flack they're getting at the moment.
I get it.
But without them, the ecosystem is incomplete.
Right.
So I just have a very innate desire that there is a lot more that can be done when you bring communities together. Yeah. And it's not just about the plug for Camped. I think in general, because I've seen the value of communities.
Well, you do time. I mean, that's what that is. Yeah.
Absolutely. It is the largest global community of entrepreneurs and investors. So not for profit. We're actually a give back community. So to be a charter member of TIE, you have to be invited. It's by invitation only. And one of the biggest criteria is not just based on how successful you've been, but what is your appetite to give back? And when I say give back, it's not about money, but help other entrepreneurs. Yeah. So I do feel that, just building on that piece around entrepreneurship, I do feel that communities will play a big role to help steer the transformation, in this knowledge economy towards what I like to term as the purpose economy. Yeah. Where, if you think about the younger generation, that's getting into the workforce, and that's a big target audience for us at Camped as well. They're very driven by purpose, and
Yeah.
they're very aware of the issues that we weren't aware of. I mean, like, we didn't really care about leaving the aircon on 24 hours. I mean, I remember when we lived in the Middle East,
Yeah.
truly water was more expensive than oil, literally was.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And a few fortunate ones actually had drinking water come in the taps
Right.
in the kitchen,
Yeah.
right? But some people still had to go and buy water,
Yeah.
or fill them up in big jerry cans. But the reality was that you didn't care. You just left because there was no cost to power, you left your air cons on all the time. I can't think of kids doing that today.
No
I
way. I
wouldn't do
mean,
it today.
it's embarrassing to say this, but like when I was expatriated from New York to Tokyo, you know, one of the things that these big financial services companies did was they paid all your expenses. This is what's being expatriated is like. You must know this a little bit. And I lived alone in a 2-story abode, and you know, in the summer times in Tokyo, it was insanely hot, like insanely hot. And I would leave my air conditioning on when I was at work, so that when I came home after my 15-minute walk from the train station in a wool suit, I was walking into a cooled home. I would never do that today. And my daughter would, if she knew that I did that, she'd shoot me, kind of thing. No way.
I know, but here's the thing. I'm sure there's some entrepreneur out there, because I know it's very feasible from a technology standpoint, that in today's world, because of that awareness,
Yep.
you can still have your aircon turned on.
Yeah, exactly.
As you reach your home in
Sure.
Tokyo. And that's probably happening. Knowing Japan, it's probably already happening in Japan.
You just put an IoT sensor in your air conditioner.
Home,
you connect to it over the internet. You're done. It's simple.
Exactly. So, so my only parting view on this piece, Michael, is that I do think that there is immense potential for the next generation in terms of what they can help us achieve and solve a lot of these problems. And I just want people to consider the possibilities through digital that are solved by entrepreneurship.
Yeah. What's the best way for people to get in touch with the right person at TIE? Is Mike pronouncing this right? It's TIE, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they can reach out to me.
Okay.
I'd be happy to connect them. You know, depending on where they're based, you know, we have about 57 chapters around the world.
Super.
And they should just go online and, you know, tie.org and find the relevant chapter. And I'm sure there'll be contacts in there they can reach out to, but otherwise they can certainly reach out to me.
Perfect. Amit Gupta, founder of Ecosystem and Camped, and so much more. Thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate your time. Really, really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. Wish you a great 2023. Great way to kick this off.
Thank you.
Thank you.